The sun hangs directly overhead, a merciless white coin in a bleached blue sky. It beats down on the cracked earth, on the sparse, thirsty sagebrush, and on the lone woman standing beside a broken-down cart. Her name is Alara, and the world has narrowed to the splintered grain of a shattered wheel and the frantic, fluttering panic in her own chest. The crack of the wood was as sharp and final as a gunshot. The lurch of the cart, the groan of the axle, and then the dead, stubborn stop. Noon, miles from the dusty settlement of Dust Devil Gulch, miles from anything that resembled help. A fine dust, stirred by a hot breeze, coats her worn dress and settles in the lines of worry around her eyes. She is heavy with child, a profound and burdensome reality in this vast, empty expanse. The life within her is a ticking clock, a constant reminder of her vulnerability. Water is a sloshing whisper in the bottom of the canteen. Hope is even lower. She presses a hand to her belly, a gesture of both protection and despair. This is it. This is how it ends. Not in a soft bed with a midwife's kind hands, but here, under the cruel gaze of the sun, defeated by a piece of shattered oak. Then a sound, not the cry of a hawk or the rustle of a lizard. A footstep, a soft scuff of a boot on hardpan earth. A shadow, long and lean, falls over her, offering the first real shade she's felt in an hour. She spins around, her heart leaping into her throat. A man stands there, seeming to have materialized from the shimmering heat waves themselves. He is tall and gaunt, dressed in the dusty, nondescript clothes of a drifter. His face is weathered, his eyes the color of a stormy sky, and they take in her, the cart, and the broken wheel in one sweeping, silent assessment. He says nothing for a long moment, and in the silence, Alara's fear solidifies. When he finally speaks, his voice is a low, gravelly rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. Looks like you're in a fix. Danger's close, and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. The statement hangs in the oppressive heat, a simple fact that encompasses the entirety of her disastrous reality. She has nothing. No money, no protection, no way out. The man's gaze is unreadable, holding no judgment, but no immediate pity either. It is the neutral, watchful gaze of a man accustomed to observing the world without becoming part of it. For Alara, stranded at the precipice of ruin, this stranger is either her savior or her final misfortune. And with the fate of 2 lives resting on the integrity of a single wooden wheel, she had no way of knowing which. The drifter moved with a slow, deliberate economy that suggested a conservation of energy born from long, hard journeys. He walked a circle around the tilted cart, his boots making soft, crunching sounds on the baked soil. Alara watched him, her hands still resting protectively on her swollen abdomen. Fear was a cold, knot in her gut, a stark contrast to the fire of the sun on her skin. Men who appeared from nowhere in the middle of the desolate territories were rarely the answer to a prayer. More often, they were the prayer's opposite. His eyes, that strange shade of gray, lingered on the broken spokes. They were snapped clean through, the wood pale and dry, brittle as old bones. He nudged a splintered piece with the toe of his worn boot. He hadn't asked her name, nor offered his own. He hadn't asked where she was from or where she was going. His focus was entirely on the mechanical problem before him, a singular point of concentration in the overwhelming emptiness of the landscape. "Axle's not cracked," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "That's something." Alara finally found her voice, though it came out thin and raspy. "I have no money to pay for a repair." She felt it was crucial to state this first, to lay the barren truth of her situation between them. There could be no misunderstanding. She possessed nothing of value. Her entire worldly wealth consisted of the threadbare blanket in the cart, a small sack of flour, a tin of coffee, and a memory of a man whose wedding band she still wore, though it was loose on her finger now. The drifter looked up from the wheel and met her gaze. For the first time, she saw something beyond mere observation in his eyes. It was a flicker of understanding, a brief acknowledgement of her desperate pride. "Didn't ask for any," he said, his voice still that low rumble. He shed a dusty bedroll from his shoulders and let it drop to the ground. From it, he unstrapped a long, heavy tool roll made of thick, oiled canvas. He spread it open, revealing a collection of tools that were surprisingly well kept. Not the meager kit of a simple farmhand, but the specific, almost surgical instruments of a smith or a master carpenter. There were files of varying coarseness, a small, heavy-headed hammer, calipers, and strange, twisted pieces of metal whose purpose she couldn't guess. He crouched by the wheel, his movements fluid and certain. He worked the busted hub free, his hands surprisingly deft. They were large, calloused hands, browned by the sun, yet they moved with a gentle precision. He laid the shattered pieces of the old spokes on the ground, arranging them like a puzzle he already knew the solution to. Alara stood by, a silent, anxious observer. She should be terrified. A strange man, armed with tools and an unnerving quietness, was dismantling her only means of transportation. But a strange sense of calm began to settle over her. His focus was so absolute, so detached from her and her predicament, that it felt safe. He wasn't looking at her as a woman, vulnerable and alone. He was looking at her as an obstacle to be overcome by the cart she was attached to. He was a man solving a problem. The sun began its slow descent toward the jagged western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple. The heat lessened, but a different kind of chill began to creep in. The chill of the coming night, of predators and the unknown. "Can it be fixed?" she asked, the question fragile. He grunted, not looking up. "Not with what's here." Woods rotted through. "Need new spokes." Strong ones. He ran a hand over his jaw, the rasp of his whiskers loud in the growing stillness. He looked around at the sparse, twisted junipers and the hardy sage. Nothing that would serve. No straight, strong wood to be had. This, she knew, was the end of his attempt. He had the skill, but not the material. She braced herself for him to stand, roll up his tools, and walk away. It was what she would expect. He owed her nothing. The brief spark of hope she'd allowed herself to feel began to die, sputtering out like a faulty lamp. But he didn't move. He remained crouched, his gaze distant, staring at the empty spaces in the wheel hub where the spokes should be. He seemed to be locked in some internal debate, his brow furrowed, and a muscle worked in his jaw. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry a profound weariness, he reached for a small, heavy leather pouch that was tied to his belt. It was a pouch he hadn't opened before, and it looked heavier than its size suggested. He untied the leather thong and tipped the contents into his palm. Alara's breath caught in her throat. She thought at first it was a trick of the fading light, a delusion brought on by heat and fear. But it wasn't. Lying in his calloused, dirt-stained hand were not pebbles or trinkets, but rods of metal. They caught the last rays of the setting sun and glowed with a deep, soft, unmistakable luster. It was gold. Not nuggets, not dust, but solid, cylindrical rods of pure, gleaming gold, each about the thickness of a man's thumb. Alara felt a wave of dizziness. This was impossible. This was madness. The man was a drifter, a wanderer. Such men had holes in their boots, not fortunes in their pockets. And even if he had it, who would be so insane as to use it for this? He selected one of the rods, weighing it in his hand. He looked from the gold to the broken wheel, then back again. He glanced at her, his stormy eyes holding a new, complex emotion. It looked like regret, resignation. "It's all I have," he said, his voice flat, as if stating a terrible, immutable fact. "All I have that's strong enough." Without another word, he picked up his hammer and a shaping tool. He placed the end of a golden rod against a flat stone he'd chosen as an anvil. And in the dying light of the desolate wilderness, under the unblinking gaze of a terrified pregnant woman, the stranger began to methodically, rhythmically, tap the precious metal into the shape of a wheel spoke. The soft, metallic clinking sound was surreal, a mad lullaby in the vast, silent desert. Each tap was a spark of impossible light, forging a secret that would bind their fates together, a secret that was both a miraculous salvation and a terrible, gleaming curse. The work was slow and precise. The drifter, whose name she still did not know, seemed to transform before her eyes. He was no longer just a wanderer. He was an artisan, a smith of some uncanny skill. He didn't use a fire. He didn't need one. He used pressure and leverage, his strange tools, and the innate malleability of the soft, heavy metal. He worked each golden rod with intense concentration, shaping the ends to fit snugly into the hub and the outer rim of the wheel. The rhythmic tink, tink, tink of his hammer was the only sound, a counterpoint to the chirping of crickets that had begun to fill the cooling air. Alara sat on the edge of the cart bed, her blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, and watched. The initial shock had given way to a profound and terrifying awe. The sheer, lunatic extravagance of the act was staggering. A single one of those spokes was worth more than any cart, any mule, more than everything she had ever owned in her life. He was using a king's ransom to fix a poor woman's broken wheel on a forgotten stretch of dirt road. Why? The question echoed in the silent chambers of her mind. Pity? It felt like more than that. It felt like an act of desperation, as if he were unburdening himself of a great weight by putting it to the most mundane, most necessary use he could find. As if the gold itself were the problem, and this was the only solution his conscience would allow. Night fell completely. He worked by the light of a small, greasy lantern he produced from his roll, its yellow glow making the gold gleam with a warm, living fire. He didn't speak, and she didn't dare to. The silence was heavy with the unspoken significance of what he was doing. They were co-conspirators in a beautiful, dangerous crime against sense. When he finally fitted the last spoke into place, he stood back to examine his work. The wheel was whole again. 12 spokes of solid gold radiated from the hub, a perfect, gleaming star of impossible wealth. It looked like something from a fairy tale, a celestial chariot's will drop to earth. It was magnificent, and it was the most dangerous thing she had ever seen. "It'll hold," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. He hoisted the heavy wheel and fitted it back onto the axle, his muscles straining under the weight. Gold was far heavier than wood. He secured it with a large pin, then gave it a spin. It turned smoothly, silently, the polished spokes blurring into a circle of pure, liquid light in the lantern's glow. He finally looked at her, his face shadowed, his expression grim. "We need to get to town before sunrise." He gestured to her blanket. "Cover it. All of it. Don't let an inch of it show." The command was stark, unnecessary. She already understood. To ride into a town like Dust Devil Gulch, a place she'd heard whispered of as a haven for hard men and opportunists, with a wheel like that was not just foolish, it was a death sentence. For him and for her. He helped her back up into the cart, his touch brief and impersonal on her elbow. He hitched her weary mule, then untied his own horse, a sturdy but unremarkable roan that had been grazing placidly nearby. He didn't get on it. Instead, he took the mule's bridle in his hand. "I'll lead," he said. "The animal's tired, and the wheel adds weight." And so they started, a slow, funereal procession through the dark. Alara sat stiffly, her entire body clenched, hyper-aware of the fortune turning beneath her. The blanket was tucked carefully, obsessively, around the wheel, but in her mind's eye, it blazed like a beacon. The man walked ahead, a silent, shadowy figure leading them out of one peril and, she feared, directly into another. He had introduced a secret into her life, a secret of immense value and immense risk. It tied him to her. He couldn't just leave her now. He had to see this through. He had to ensure the spectacular, reckless kindness he had performed did not get them both killed. They arrived at the outskirts of Dust Devil Gulch as the first gray fingers of dawn clawed at the eastern sky. The town looked like it had been carved from the dust and rock by a resentful hand. The buildings were unpainted, weathered wood, hunched together along a single wide, rutted street. A saloon with louvered doors, a general store with a sagging porch, a blacksmith's forge, and a sheriff's office with a barred window. It was a place that felt perpetually thirsty, a place where hope came to die. The man, she decided to call him Silas in her own mind, for he had the quiet, steadfast look of a Silas, led them not to the main livery, but to a smaller, more dilapidated stable at the far end of town. A single, bleary-eyed stable hand was swamping out the entryway. He was a weedy young man with shifty eyes and a perpetually resentful expression. "Need a stall for the mule." "Just for a day," Silas said, his voice low. He kept himself between the stable hand and the cart, subtly shielding the covered wheel from view. The boy, whose name was Gus, spat a stream of tobacco juice near Silas's boot. "Cost you 2 bits." Silas dropped the coins into his grubby palm without haggling. As he led the mule inside, the corner of the blanket snagged on a splintered doorframe and pulled away, just for a second. It was no more than a heartbeat, but in the thin, early morning light it was enough. Gus's eyes, which had been dull with sleep and indifference, suddenly sharpened. A flicker of something, disbelief, then pure, naked avarice, flashed across his face. He saw the unmistakable glint of yellow metal. He didn't say a word. He quickly looked away, pulling his face back into a mask of sullenness. But the change had been profound. He had seen. Silas, his back turned, hadn't noticed the slip. But Alara, watching from the cart, saw it all. She saw the moment the secret was compromised. Her blood ran cold. Silas finished settling the mule and returned to her. "There's a boarding house across the way, run by a widow. Should be safe enough." Safe. The word sounded foreign, absurd. She nodded, unable to speak. As Silas helped her down, she risked a glance back at the stable. Gus was gone. He wasn't sweeping. He wasn't tending to the animals. He had vanished, scurrying away like a rat with a stolen crumb, his mind no doubt racing with the impossible, glittering secret he had just uncovered. And Alara knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in her stomach, where a man like that would run in a town like this. He would run straight to the biggest wolf in the valley. A man she'd only heard of in fearful tales passed between travelers, Jedediah Thorne. The man who owned Dust Devil Gulch, body and soul. The boarding house was cleaner than the town's exterior suggested, but the air inside was thick with the smell of boiled cabbage and suspicion. The proprietress, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Gable, looked them over with sharp, bird-like eyes. She took in Alara's pregnant state, Silas's drifter appearance, and the lack of wedding bands on his hands. Her lips thinned into a line of disapproval. "I don't run a charity," she sniffed, her gaze lingering on Alara's belly. "We're paying," Silas said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He placed a few coins on the counter, more than the usual rate. Mrs. Gable's expression softened fractionally as she swept the money into a drawer. "1 room. Top of the stairs. No trouble. It was a command, not a welcome." The room was small and sparse, containing a narrow bed, a washstand with a chipped porcelain basin, and a single window that looked out onto the bleak main street. It felt less like a refuge and more like a cell. Alara sank onto the lumpy mattress, the exhaustion of the last 24 hours washing over her in a tidal wave. The adrenaline that had kept her going had vanished, leaving behind a deep, trembling fear. Silas stood by the door, his posture rigid, his presence filling the small space. He was a caged animal, out of his element and acutely aware of the closing walls. The wilderness was his home, a place of clean dangers and honest struggles. This town was a different kind of trap, a web of whispers, greed, and unseen power structures. "You should rest," he said, not looking at her. He stared out the window, his gaze fixed on the street below. He was watching, waiting. He saw, Alara said, her voice barely a whisper. The boy at the stable. The blanket slipped. He saw the gold. Silas's shoulders tensed. He didn't turn around, but she could feel the change in him, the sudden stillness of a predator that has caught a scent on the wind. For a long moment, he was silent. "I know," he said finally, his voice tight. "I was careless." The admission hung between them, a shared weight. His carelessness, her misfortune. They were bound by it. Why? She asked, the question that had been burning in her since he'd first opened that leather pouch. Why would you do such a thing? Use that. He turned from the window at last, and the look in his eyes was raw and haunted. The detached, watchful mask was gone, replaced by a profound weariness. Because I couldn't leave you there, he said simply. And because it was all I had, he sank onto the room's single rickety chair, the wood groaning in protest. He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of deep fatigue. The gold isn't a blessing, ma'am, he said, his voice low and bitter. It's a curse. My partner and I, we found a vein up in the Sierras, the kind men dream of. We were going to be kings. He gave a short, mirthless laugh. My partner, Tom, he got greedy, got loud, started flashing nuggets in a mining town not unlike this one. A week later, I found him at the bottom of a ravine with a knife in his back. The claim jumpers who did it came for me next. He fell silent, his gaze lost in a past she could only imagine. I got away. With this, he slapped the leather pouch still tied to his belt. Enough to make a man rich forever and not worth a single damn thing. Everywhere I go, it's a threat. It tempts the desperate and the greedy. It turns good men into thieves and thieves into murderers. It cost me my friend. It cost me my name. I've been running from it for a year. He looked at the broken wheel in his mind's eye. She could tell. When I saw you, your wheel, I didn't have wood. I didn't have anything else strong enough. So I used the curse. I tried to turn it into something good. Just once he looked at her, his stormy eyes pleading for understanding. I tried to make it a tool, not a treasure. A fragile, aching sympathy bloomed in Alara's chest, pushing aside some of her fear. He was not a madman. He was a haunted one, a man burdened by a treasure he couldn't spend and a past he couldn't escape. His reckless act of kindness was an attempt at penance, an effort to reshape the meaning of the metal that had destroyed his life. But his attempt at redemption had failed. It had simply pulled her into the curse with him. As if summoned by their conversation, a heavy tread sounded on the stairs. It was purposeful, authoritarian. A sharp rap on the door made them both jump. "Open up. Sheriff's business," a voice boomed. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his body shielding Alara from the door. He didn't reach for a weapon, but his entire being coiled like a spring. He looked at Alara, a silent question in his eyes. She gave a tiny, terrified nod. There was no running. Silas opened the door. Standing there was a large, beefy man with a drooping mustache and a tin star pinned crookedly to his vest. His eyes were small and mean. Behind him, looking smug and important, was Gus, the stable hand. The sheriff's gaze swept the room, dismissing Silas and landing on Alara with predatory interest. He didn't seem to care about the man. His orders, it was clear, were about the cart. "The woman," the sheriff grunted, pointing a thick finger at Alara. "Mr. Thorne wants a word. Seems there's a question about some property you've come into possession of." He smirked, a greasy, knowing expression. "He's willing to be generous. For the cart and the mule. $100, and you'll be on the next stage out of town. Both of you." It wasn't an offer. It was an ultimatum. Sell the source of the gold for a pittance and be exiled, or face the wrath of the man who owned the town. Jedediah Thorne hadn't even bothered to come himself. He had sent his dog. The trap had been sprung. Silas's curse, which he had tried to forge into a blessing, had become a cage, and its bars were closing around them both. The sheriff's ultimatum hung in the stale air of the room, thick and suffocating. $100. It was an insulting sum, a clear signal that this was not a negotiation but a demand. Thorne wasn't buying a cart. He was seizing an opportunity, and he was using the law as his cudgel. The unspoken part of the offer was the threat. Refuse, and charges would be invented. Vagrancy, theft, anything to give Thorne the legal pretext to take what he wanted. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at Silas. The muscles in his jaw were corded tight, his eyes like chips of flint. He understood the game perfectly. Thorne didn't know for sure what Gus had seen. A glint of gold could mean anything from a loose nugget to a bit of fancy brass. But he was a man who never let a rumor of wealth pass him by. He was casting his net, and they were caught in it. "We'll need to discuss it," Silas said, his voice dangerously level. He managed to sound reasonable, but Alara could feel the coiled fury radiating from him. The sheriff shrugged, his expression smug. Don't take too long. Mr. Thorne ain't a patient man. You got till sundown. He gave Gus a shove. Get back to work. Gus scurried away, pleased with the trouble he'd caused. The sheriff gave them one last contemptuous look and lumbered back down the stairs. The moment the door closed, the fragile peace of the room shattered. Alara pressed her hands to her face, trying to hold back the tears of sheer, helpless terror. This was all her fault. Her broken cart, her journey, her presence. She had brought this doom upon the one man who had tried to help her. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice choked. You should go. Take your horse and ride. You can get away. He wants the cart, not you. Silas turned to her, and for the first time since they'd met, his guard seemed to drop entirely. The haunted, weary man was still there, but now he was overlaid with a fierce, protective resolve. And leave you here? To him. He shook his head, a sharp, definitive motion. No, this isn't your fault. This is his. He gestured vaguely toward the window, in the direction of Thorne's unseen domain. This is what men like him do. They prey on the weak. They smell desperation and call it opportunity. He began to pace the small room, his steps restless, caged. Running is what I've been doing for a year. Running from this metal, running from men like Thorne. And what has it gotten me? A life spent looking over my shoulder. Tom, my partner, he was a fool for flashing his wealth. But I was a coward for hiding mine, for letting it rule me. He stopped in front of her, his eyes blazing with a new, hard-won fire. No more running. Thorne thinks he's cornered a couple of vagrants. He thinks he can bully us, scare us into handing over a treasure he hasn't even seen. He's greedy, and we're going to use that greed against him. A wild, desperate plan was beginning to form in his eyes. Alara could see it taking shape, a gamble so audacious it made her head spin. What are you going to do? He wants the cart, Silas said, a grim smile touching his lips. Fine, we'll sell him the cart, but not in some backroom deal. We'll do it in the open, in front of the whole town. We're going to hold an auction. Alara stared at him, aghast. An auction? You can't. You'll show everyone the wheel. They'll tear us apart. Thorne will have us arrested for inciting a riot. Let him try, Silas said, his voice ringing with conviction. He operates in the shadows. He uses fear and intimidation. The one thing men like Thorne can't stand is daylight. We're going to put a spotlight right on him. We're going to show this town exactly who he is. He came closer, crouching down, so he was at her eye level. His large, calloused hand hovered for a moment before gently, hesitantly, covering hers where it rested on her belly. The touch was electric, a jolt of warmth and strength that shot through her. It was the first moment of genuine, personal connection between them, born not of necessity, but of a shared defiance. I brought this trouble to your door, Alara, he said, using her name for the first time. It sounded solid and real in his voice. I swear to you, and to your child, I will see you clear of it. In his eyes, she no longer saw a drifter. She saw a man drawing a line in the sand. A man who had been pushed too far, who had decided to stop running from his past and instead to forge it into a weapon. His curse, the heavy gold that had been his burden, was about to become his sword and his shield. The fear in her heart didn't vanish, but it was joined now by a sliver of something else, something she hadn't felt in a very long time, a dangerous, terrifying, exhilarating flicker of hope. She looked from his determined face to their joined hands, and she made her choice. She would stand with him. All right, she said, her voice steady now. What do we do? The plan Silas laid out was simple in its audacity, relying on the predictable pillars of human nature, Thorne's boundless avarice and the town's simmering resentment. For the rest of the afternoon, they prepared. First, Silas retrieved something from the bottom of his bedroll, something he had kept hidden even from her. It was a folded, oilskin-wrapped document. He carefully unfolded it to reveal a claim deed, properly filed and stamped by a territorial magistrate in a distant county. The name on the claim was the Lost Dutchman's Folly, his name, or the name he used then, was on it. Silas Kane. It's real, he told her. The claim is legal. The gold is mine. That's our anchor. Thorne can call me a thief, but he can't argue with a territorial seal. Next, he took one of the smaller and used gold rods from his pouch. With a file from his tool roll, he scraped a small pile of glistening dust onto a piece of paper. He folded it carefully and handed it to her. I need you to go to the blacksmith, he instructed. Tell him you need the strongest set of oak spokes he can make. Urgently. Pay him with this. Pay him double his asking price. Tell him it's for an emergency repair and you need them by dusk. Alara's eyes widened. And what will you be doing? A grim smile touched Silas's lips. I'm going to invite Mr. Thorne to an auction. Dust Devil Gulch simmered in the late afternoon heat. The townspeople moved with a languid slowness, seeking shade on porches and in the cool darkness of the saloon. When Silas Kane strode down the center of the main street, his purpose was so starkly different from the town's lazy rhythm that people stopped to watch. He wasn't meandering. He was marching. He walked directly to the largest building in town, a two-story affair with a painted sign that read simply, Thorne Enterprises. He didn't knock. He pushed the door open and walked in. The clerk at the front desk, a man with a green eye shade and nervous disposition, jumped to his feet. You can't just. I'm here to see Thorne. Silas cut him off, his voice leaving no room for argument. Tell him the drifter with the cart is here to accept his offer. The message was relayed. A moment later, a heavy door opened, and Jedediah Thorne appeared. He was a man built of soft living and hard bargains. His tailored suit stretched tight across a portly middle, his face florid and accustomed to command. He eyed Silas with the smug superiority of a man who believed he had already won. So, Thorne said, his voice a rich, condescending baritone, you've come to your senses. $100 is a generous offer for a broken-down piece of junk. The offer is appreciated, Silas said, his expression unreadable. But I think the property might be worth more. So I've decided to let the market decide. I'm holding a public auction for the cart and mule. Right here, in the street. In 1 hour. I thought, as a man of business, you'd want the first invitation. Thorne's condescending smile froze on his face. His eyes narrowed. An auction? Are you a fool? Who in this town has the coin to bid against me? Perhaps no one, Silas replied calmly. But it seems the fair way to do business, doesn't it? Publicly. Transparently. He let the words hang in the air, a subtle challenge to Thorne's reputation. Unless, of course, you're afraid of a little open competition. The color deepened in Thorne's face. The drifter was mocking him. In his own office. The audacity was breathtaking. Thorne's mind raced. An auction with a risk, but a public one he could control. He could intimidate any other potential bidders, and it would allow him to acquire the prize legally, in front of witnesses, cementing his power over the town. The fool was playing right into his hands. Fine, dormiznierd. Have your little auction. It will be a short 1 inch. 1 hour, Silas repeated. He turned and walked out, leaving Thorne standing in the doorway, a look of predatory glee spreading across his features. The fool had no idea what he was up against. Meanwhile, Alara walked on shaking legs to the blacksmith's forge at the other end of town. The smith was a mountain of a man named Bjorn, with arms like tree trunks and a kind, weary face. He looked at her pregnant belly and the desperation in her eyes, and his expression softened. What can I do for you, ma'am? She explained her need for the spokes, her voice trembling slightly. When she unfolded the paper and showed him the shimmering gold dust, his eyes went wide. He looked from the gold to her, then back again. He'd seen gold dust before, but this was a payment for Will's spokes. It made no sense, but he also saw the fear in her eyes, and he understood this was more than a simple transaction. It will take me till sundown, he said, his voice a low rumble. But I will have them for you. The best oak I have. He scooped the gold dust into a small tin. This is more than enough. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows down the main street, a crowd began to gather. The news had spread like wildfire. The drifter was auctioning off his cart. Thorne himself was going to bid. It was the most excitement Dust Devil Gulch had seen in years. Silas led the mule and cart into the center of the street, directly in front of Thorne's office. The blanket was still draped over the golden wheel. Alara stood beside him, her hand resting on the cart for support. The whole town seemed to be there. Mrs. Gable peered from the boarding house window. The nervous clerk from Thorne's office watched from the doorway. And in the front row stood Thorne himself, flanked by the sheriff and 2 hired thugs, his face a mask of smug anticipation. "All right, folks," Silas called out, his voice carrying in the still evening air. "A simple auction for this fine mule and this sturdy cart." Thorne laughed, a loud, booming sound meant to intimidate. "Sturdy? I heard it had a broken wheel drifter. What's it held together with?" Twine and wishful thinking. The crowd chuckled nervously. This was the moment. Silas met Alara's eyes, giving her a small, reassuring nod. She took a deep breath. "The wheel was broken," Silas called back, his voice steady and clear. "But I fixed it. I'm a man who believes in using the best materials for the job." And with a smooth, theatrical motion, he reached down and pulled the blanket away. A collective gasp swept through the crowd, a sound like the wind rushing through a canyon. In the fiery light of the setting sun, the wheel blazed. The 12 spokes of solid gold were not just bright. They were obscene, a stunning, breathtaking testament to an impossible fortune. The light caught the polished surfaces and threw dazzling reflections across the faces of the stunned townspeople. Thorne's jaw dropped. His smug expression vanished, replaced by one of pure, stupefied greed. It wasn't a nugget. It wasn't a bit of plating. It was solid. He had vastly, colossally underestimated the prize. For a moment, there was complete silence. The town of Dust Devil Gulch was mesmerized. Then Thorne found his voice, bellowing with rage and thwarted desire. "That's stolen," he roared, pointing a trembling finger at the wheel. "That gold is stolen. Sheriff, arrest this man. Seize that property as evidence." The sheriff puffed out his chest and took a step forward, his hand moving toward his pistol. This was the moment of truth, the pivot on which their entire gamble rested. "Stolen." Silas's voice cut through the commotion, sharp and clear as a pistol shot. He reached into his coat and produced the oilskin document, holding it up for all to see. "This is a legal claim deed, filed with the territorial government for the lost Dutchman's Folly mine. My mine." He let his gaze sweep over the crowd, meeting the eyes of the shopkeepers, the ranchers, the blacksmith Bjorn who was standing in the back, his arms crossed over his massive chest. "The gold is mine," Silas declared, his voice ringing with authority. "And according to the law, a man's property is his own. But Mr. Thorne seems to think he has a better claim to it than I do. He tried to buy it from me in private for $100. A murmur went through the crowd. $100. For that. The sheer, predatory gall of it was not lost on them. They had all been squeezed by Thorne at one time or another, overcharged for supplies, underpaid for their goods, threatened with foreclosure. They recognized the tactic. Thorne's face was purple with rage. He had been played, publicly humiliated. "This is a trick. He's a thief and a charlatan. I'm confiscating that gold as a danger to this town. Then you'll have to go through me." A deep voice rumbled from the back of the crowd. Bjorn the blacksmith stepped forward, his expression grim. "The man's deed looks legal to me, and this woman paid me for my work with honest gold. This feels more like theft than justice, Sheriff." A few other men, emboldened by the blacksmith stand, nodded in agreement. The town's fear of Thorne was being outweighed by their collective resentment, brought to a boil by this brazen, public display of greed. Silas pressed his advantage. "I don't want to sell it to Mr. Thorne in private," he announced. "I want to offer it to the town. I'll sell this wheel, right now, for $5,000. It was a fortune, but a fraction of its true worth. And the proceeds," he continued, putting a protective arm around Alara, "will go to setting Mrs. Alara Vance and her coming child up in a home. Right here, the old bakery, perhaps. A legitimate, contributing member of this community." He had turned the tables completely. He wasn't a drifter seeking to profit. He was a benefactor, a founder of a new local business, a protector of a widow and her unborn child. He was offering the town a chance to invest in itself rather than in Thorne's pockets. Cornered, Humiliated, his authority crumbling, Thorne sputtered, speechless with fury. He couldn't bid. It would legitimize the entire affair. He couldn't take it by force. The town was turning against him, and his own sheriff was beginning to look hesitant, his hand frozen halfway to his gun. To shoot a man over a legal property dispute, in front of a dozen witnesses who were now on the man's side, was a risk even he wasn't willing to take. Alara, who had been standing frozen in fear, felt a surge of courage. She found her voice, clear and strong, and it carried over the silent crowd. "This man," she said, looking at Silas, "saved my life when I was stranded and alone. He used what he had to help me." Then she turned her gaze, hard and unflinching, on Thorne. "What has Mr. Thorne ever done for any of us, except take?" That was the final blow. The truth of it, spoken so plainly by the vulnerable woman he had tried to exploit, broke the last vestiges of his power. With a snarl of pure hatred, Thorne turned on his heel and stormed back into his office, slamming the door behind him. The sheriff, looking deeply uncomfortable, slowly lowered his hand from his gun and tried to melt back into the crowd. The hired thugs, seeing their employer retreat, quickly followed. It was over. In the middle of the street, under the last glorious rays of the setting sun, Silas and Alara stood together. The golden wheel gleamed between them, no longer a symbol of a curse or a danger, but monument to their victory. They had faced the wolf in his den and walked away unharmed. The silence that followed was not one of fear, but of awe and a newfound, fragile respect. The town of Dust Devil Gulch had a new story to tell, and it was a story made of courage, defiance, and 12 impossible spokes of gold. In the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, a new atmosphere settled over Dust Devil Gulch. The oppressive weight of Thorne's authority had been lifted, replaced by a tentative, uncertain freedom. The townspeople, who had watched the drama unfold with a mix of fear and fascination, now looked at Silas and Alara with a dawning respect. They kept their distance, but their glances were no longer suspicious or hostile. They were appreciative. Bjorn the blacksmith was the first to approach, carrying a bundle of freshly carved oak spokes, their woody scent clean and earthy in the cooling air. He laid them gently on the ground. "These are ready," he said, his voice a low rumble. He looked at the golden wheel, then at Silas. "I have never seen a thing like that, or a man like you." He gave a short, formal bow of his head and retreated to his forge without another word. The auction was forgotten. Its purpose had already been served. Silas, with a quiet efficiency, set about dismantling his magnificent, temporary creation. Using his tools, he carefully removed the golden spokes one by one, the crowd watching in reverent silence. As he worked, Alara felt a profound sense of relief, as if a great and terrible weight was being lifted from her soul. The gold was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a wildfire, dangerous and uncontrollable. Silas replaced the golden rods with Bjorn's sturdy oak spokes. The wheel became ordinary again, a simple wooden circle meant for work and travel. It was whole, it was strong, and it was safe. He took one of the heavy gold rods and, with a heavy-duty cutter from Bjorn's forge, decisively snipped off a substantial piece. He walked to the empty, dilapidated building that had once been the town bakery, its windows clouded with dust and its sign faded. The "For Sale" notice tacked to the door was weathered and curling. An hour later, after a brief and entirely civil negotiation with the clerk from Thorne Enterprises, a man who was now almost comically eager to please, the deeds to the bakery and the small cottage behind it were in Alara's name. The price was paid from a small fraction of the single golden spoke. The rest of the gold, now packed away, was once again a secret, but it was no longer a curse. It was a tool, a potential, a foundation for the future he had promised her. Weeks melted into a month. The oppressive heat of summer gave way to the gentler warmth of early autumn. Dust Devil Gulch was changing. Thorne remained secluded in his office, his public humiliation having neutered his influence. People walked with their heads held a little higher. The old bakery was transformed. Silas, it turned out, was as skilled with a hammer and saw as he was with gold and strange tools. He repaired the leaking roof, replaced the broken windows, and built sturdy new shelves. Alara, with a strength she didn't know she possessed, scrubbed the place from floor to ceiling until it shone. She found her late husband's recipes in a small, worn notebook and began to bake. Soon, the scent of fresh bread, of cinnamon and yeast and life, drifted down the main street, a fragrant announcement of new beginnings. People came, at first out of curiosity, then out of a genuine hunger for her warm, crusty loaves and sweet rolls. They would find Silas there, often sitting on the newly repaired porch of the cottage, mending a harness or carving a small wooden toy, a silent, watchful guardian. He was no longer the drifter, he was Silas, and he hadn't left. Alara's body grew rounder, her movements slower but more certain. The constant fear that had been her companion for so long had receded, replaced by a quiet, deep-seated peace. She had a home. She had a purpose. She had a protector. Her life, which had shattered along with her wheel, had been rebuilt, stronger and more beautiful than before. One late afternoon, as the setting sun cast a golden glow over the town, Alara stood in the doorway of her bakery, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. She watched Silas as he put the finishing touches on a new railing for the cottage porch. He worked with the same focused, quiet intensity he'd had when fixing her wheel, but the grim tension was gone from his shoulders. He looked up, as if feeling her gaze, and their eyes met across the small yard. He gave her a small, slow smile. It was not the grim, mirthless quirk of the mouth she had seen before. This was a genuine smile, one that reached his stormy gray eyes and softened their intensity, warming them like the sun on a placid sea. Alara felt her own lips curve in response, a smile of pure, unadulterated contentment. In that shared, silent moment, the truth settled between them, as solid and real as the oak spokes in her cartwheel. The greatest treasure had not been the gold. It had been the catalyst. It had been the thing that broke them both free from their pasts and forged a new, shared future. He had fixed her wheel, and in doing so, he had fixed both their lives, creating something far more precious than metal. A home, a sanctuary, and the quiet promise of a family, built not on a claim of land, but on a foundation of impossible, reckless, and transformative kindness. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.